Well, hey, welcome all you wiretappers out there back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. This is retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit Sergeant Gary Jenkins with another show. We're going back into the 30s today. You know, we usually deal with these 70s gangsters a lot and 60s gangsters, mafia, but this is going to go back to the 30s and the days of the bank robbers, the Midwest bank robbers. I mean, they cut a wide swath across this country. And we have a book by John Oller, Gangster Hunters, and here it is. And you'll find links in the show notes to where you can find that book. He does a great job of telling many of the unknown stories and the known stories in great detail of the famous bank robbers, Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and the Ma Barker gang and Machine Gun Kelly and all those great nicknames. So welcome, John. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, John, how did you get into this? Tell us a little bit about your history.
I was a lawyer for many years, and then I retired from active practice and to pursue a writing career or writing avocation, I would call it. And I've concentrated on nonfiction, American history, biography, and true crime. This is my third true crime book, which I find a genre that interests me. What I found out is that while all the bank robbers, Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface Nelson, etc., Bonnie and Clyde in particular, have been written about many times over.
Yeah.
And movies made of them, and you know, everybody's heard of them. Very few people know anything about the kind of anonymous FBI agents who chased and captured and in some cases killed them. Of course, everybody knows J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
But Hoover, by design, kept his agents anonymous because he wanted all the glory of the FBI to flow to him alone.
I have read about that. I understand that Melvin Purvis actually was almost forced out of the service because J. Edgar Hoover was so jealous that he was getting all those headlines up in Chicago.
Yeah, Melvin Purvis is probably the only FBI field agent from that era who people might recognize the name. Of course, he's been played in a number of movies, most recently in the Johnny Depp movie Public Enemies. Johnny Depp played Dillinger and Christian Bale played Melvin Purvis, although it wasn't a very historically accurate portrayal. I mean, Christian Bale is this kind of handsome, big guy, and Melvin Purvis was this little, thin, wispy guy, 5'7", 130 pounds. So other than Purvis, probably most of the FBI guys in my book, other than Purvis and Hoover, the general public has never heard of. And so that attracted me to telling their story. And what I did is I tracked down a bunch of living relatives of these FBI agents, children, grandchildren, nephews, grandnephews, etc. And surprisingly, a surprising number were still living. So I would interview them, and you know, they had family stories and in some cases photos of guys that had never been published before, and there's a number of those in the book. So, and then I used a lot of raw FBI files to do the research because there are voluminous FBI files on all these cases. And it takes a long time to sift through them. They're very lengthy reports, single spaced, 20 pages or more. So I had to read all those. But that's how I went about it.
Yeah, I see. Here's one, Johnny Madala. What do you call a briefcase agent? A briefcase agent.
Yes.
That's like an agent that just has a briefcase, not a gun, particularly. I know those early guys.
Yeah, well,
that carry guns.
That's kind of a theme of the book. Is a lot of these early FBI agents entered the bureau, thinking that they were going to have desk jobs. It was kind of a white collar job. They would maybe investigate antitrust violations and bank fraud and that kind of thing. perceived to be sort of a cushy job, which paid relatively well during the Depression. And a lot of these guys were lawyers, and they couldn't really get jobs as lawyers, so they went into government service. And then all of a sudden, this war on crime broke out in 1933. These guys were pressed into service, and they, instead of a briefcase, now they had a Tommy gun in their hands, which they had never shot. A lot of these guys had never fired a weapon in their life and never been fired at by anyone. Now, some were, particularly the guys from the South, were a little more gun savvy, and the Southwest. But the younger guys, they did not sign up for this for this tour of duty, but yet they got thrown into it, and they were fairly inexperienced in the beginning, and they didn't have a lot of technological wherewithal. They didn't have two-way radios, they didn't have cell phones, obviously, they didn't have night vision goggles. It was just their own wits and bravado that they had to develop to take on these gangsters who were much more heavily armed, had faster cars, elaborately planned getaways, which were much better planned than the FBI raids. So all of the deck was stacked in favor of the gangsters in the beginning.
Yeah, really. Tell me something. Did you stumble across this story? I seem to remember this, that at least one of these guys, I think it was who was arrested down in New Orleans. Was that
Alvin Karpis?
Alvin Karpis. Was did J. Edgar Hoover tell them to wait until he got there so he could be part of the arrest team or something? There's some story I remember about that.
Yes. He had been embarrassed in Congress because he testified at a hearing. He was seeking more money for the FBI, and one of the senators who didn't like the FBI, there were a lot of people who thought that the FBI was kind of this national police force, and they didn't like that. And so anyway, so this senator was grilling Hoover, and he asked him, have you ever personally made an arrest? And Hoover had to admit, no. I mean, Hoover was a desk man his entire life. He spent his 24/7 at his desk in Washington. And he was embarrassed by that. And so he came out of the meeting and he told his people, because he knew they were closing in on Alvin Karpis.
Yeah.
And I think he knew at some point that Karpis was going to be arrested in New Orleans. And he said, I want to be there for that. So he flew to New Orleans, and he was in on the arrest. He didn't personally make the arrest, although he kind of allowed the press to portray him as the guy who arrested Alvin Karpis. So it was sort of, by that time, Alvin Karpis was public enemy number one. That was a term they used back then for the most wanted, and all the other public enemies number one had been killed, or I guess killed. Before that, Karpis was the last one standing, and so Hoover was christened public hero number one. So public hero number one arrested public enemy number one. That was kind of the legend.
Yeah.
They did not expect to take Karpis alive, because every other public enemy number one, Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, had died in a shootout. They figured Karpis would be the same. So when they arrested him, almost by accident, he came out of his hotel or his rooming house. Nobody had any handcuffs. They hadn't brought any handcuffs along because they didn't expect to take him alive. And so one of the agents, a guy named Buck Buchanan, took off his necktie and handed it to one of the other agents, and they used the necktie to tie Karpis's hands. And Hoover actually asked the agent to send him that necktie for his exhibit room in Washington, which he did, although it's been lost to history over the years. It disappeared. But anyway, that was a little tidbit of the Karpis arrest.
Interesting. Now you talk about how they didn't even have as good of plans the story of the Battle of Little Bohemia. I've done that not too long ago, so we don't need to really belabor it. But
Right.
that was such a good example of they just jumped in their cars and headed north, and they got in a plane and headed north and got up there and then borrowed another guy's car and drove out to that
Yes.
lodge and then shot up all the wrong people at the start. It was,
Right.
I
Right.
mean, there
Right.
was no plan.
Well, the problem was that they got there that night. You've probably covered this, but I'll just briefly touch on it. They got there that night, and they knew that Dillinger and his gang were holed up in the Little Bohemia hotel lodge,
Yeah.
and they were planning to raid it the next morning. But then they got word filtered out to them through an informant that no, Dillinger had changed his plans and he was leaving that night. So they either had to strike then or miss him. So they decided to go ahead with the thing, and it was too dark, and so there was confusion in the darkness, and they ended up killing an innocent civilian by accident, and one of the agents got killed by Babyface Nelson, and it was a fiasco. And after that, a lot of people thought that Hoover would lose his job, and Melvin Purvis, who was in charge of the operation, they thought that he would lose and should lose his job. It had been botched so badly. So that was a very tenuous time for the FBI. And instead, what happened, there was a public uproar, and Congress passed some laws to strengthen the FBI and made things illegal that had not been illegal before, such as killing a federal officer, which was not a federal crime back then. They stumbled and bumbled around quite a bit in those early days.
Yeah. One thing I will say, they extracted a price. They made Babyface Nelson pay for killing that agent up there in Little Bohemia. Yes. And that's a story in itself. Now, you cover that from the FBI's angle particularly. Can you tell us about that, killing of Babyface Nelson?
That was in Barrington, Illinois, which is a little south of couple hours south of a resort in Wisconsin named Lake Como. A couple of agents were staking out a hotel in Lake Como where they were told Babyface Nelson was going to show up anytime. And he did show up. They didn't recognize him at first, and they thought about taking a shot at him. They decided not to because they weren't really sure that it was him. But anyway, he got away from the hotel. They did get his license plate number, and he was with another one of his gang members and with his wife, Helen Gillis. And so the word got back to Chicago, the Chicago office, that they had spotted Babyface Nelson and had his license plate number. So a couple agents went out in a car searching for him and the license plate number. They did see the car. They started to follow him. He turned around, started following them.
Oh,
and then another car came by, and there was a gun battle, and two of the FBI agents were killed by Babyface Nelson in that gun battle in Barrington, Illinois. But Babyface Nelson was also killed or mortally wounded in the same battle. So he holds the distinction, Babyface Nelson, of having killed more FBI agents than any other person in history. It's 3, 1 at Little Bohemia and 2 in this battle at Great Barrington. He was basically a psychopath. I mean, he was a cold-blooded killer, and he hated cops.
Yeah, I think back to those times, and these guys all the criminals were carrying. They were raiding these armories, these National Guard armories, and they were getting these BARs, and that you could buy these Colt Monitor Thompson submachine gun, basically. Although Colt made their own version of it, you could buy them at a drugstore. I mean, at a hardware store. You could. Guns were really available to these guys, and the FBI had just started carrying guns.
Yes. The BAR was the favorite of Clyde Barrow. He preferred it to the Thompson submachine gun because a BAR could cut through an armored car. It was just much more powerful. And Clyde, he cut his down. It was a BAR is a Browning automatic rifle. It's a big thing. Clyde sawed his off so that he could hold it on his shoulder by a strap. And then the Colt Monitor, which was kind of also a shortened version of the BAR, became the first FBI fighting rifle a couple years later. Hoover wasn't interested in it at first, and then he saw what it could accomplish, so he bought up a bunch of them. There was only about 120 ever manufactured.
Oh, really?
And if you can find one today, they're worth over $100,000.
Wow, that's a collector's item. Wow.
Yeah. Anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, the gun, that's a whole story in itself. I was browsing around. I found a whole website that's just dedicated to the guns of these 30s gangsters and the Colt, the 1911 Colt 45 and some of the different guns that they used back then. They were popular with them. And believe me, the local cops especially were totally outgunned by these guys.
Oh yeah. I mean, they had old 6-shooters,
Yeah.
pistols. And Babyface Nelson had what they called a baby machine gun. It was basically a pistol which fired automatic, and he got it custom made by a gun dealer down in Texas who serviced a lot of these criminals, and that's the gun he used to kill the agent at Little Bohemia.
Oh, really? Did you have a picture? Did you have a picture of that in your book?
Yes.
I remember I was looking over those pictures. Yeah, I'll make sure I get that picture up. Boy, that's interesting.
Yeah, I have a picture of the Colt Monitor, which is a version of the BAR, and the Thompson submachine gun, and the baby machine gun that Babyface Nelson favored, as well as pictures of some of the getaway cars. The gangsters had these pretty fast getaway cars. There was one called the Essex Terraplane, which Dillinger liked. And Clyde Barrow had a big Ford V8, powerful Ford V8. Now, I say these were big, powerful. In fact, the gangster cars back then, while they were faster than the law enforcement cars, they'd be blown off the road by a family Toyota Corolla today, which can go 120 probably. Yeah. These gangster cars really couldn't go more than 80. And if you were on the roads back then, the dirt roads, you were risking being run off the road if you went more than 45 or 50. So they looked very pretty. And they still do, the antiques, but they really weren't that fast, other than relative to the law enforcement vehicles.
Another famous story. Why don't we talk about this a little bit? And it's partly because, at least when I was young, there was an old movie that played about the Ma Barker gang, and there's this famous film clip where she's like got this machine gun, she's screaming out the window, and she's fighting tooth and nail and shooting with back and forth these FBI agents, which these guys all battled with the agents. Hardly anybody gave up. Only Machine Gun Kelly, as far as I can tell, gave up. I don't think anybody else gave up.
I think that's right. Karpis gave up, but that's only because he was surrounded. But
trapped.
Ma Barker, she's an interesting case because Hoover manufactured this myth about her that she was the criminal mastermind of the Barker Karpis gang. She had 4 sons. They were all criminals. 2 of them, Doc Barker and Fred Barker, were the main Barker gang guys. And they teamed up with Alvin Karpis to form the Barker Karpis gang. But Hoover said she was a diabolical, criminal mastermind. That wasn't true. Another gangster said that she couldn't plan a breakfast. She was basically this woman from the Ozarks who listened to hillbilly music, and I guess you call it hill country music is the more euphemistic term. But And she liked to play bingo and listen to Amos and Andy on the radio, which is a popular old show. But she did know that her sons were criminals, and she helped them out. She helped them get parole, and she willingly accepted their money to buy fur coats and the like and jewelry. So, but anyway, she finally gets holed up, holed up in this house with her son Fred in Florida, near Ocala, Florida. And the FBI tracked her down there, tracked her and her son. They surrounded the place and ordered her to come out, and Fred Barker, her son, with their hands up. They didn't come out. Ordered them again. They still didn't come out. And then all of a sudden, these machine gun fire started coming out of an upper window at the FBI agents. And it turned out that machine gun fire and rifle fire started coming from multiple windows in this house. And so it couldn't have all been coming from one person because it was simultaneous shooting. And I believe, and I think most historians agree, that she was doing some of the shooting with a machine gun. Now, I don't think she was particularly adept with a machine gun. I'm not sure she'd ever fired one before. But she decided she was going to go down with her son in a blaze of glory. And there's a photo that was taken by an FBI agent after she was killed and her son was killed in an upstairs bedroom. And it shows her with a machine gun at her side next to her hands. And I have that photo in the book as well. So it's not been seen. It's a fairly rare photograph. I got it from the son of one of the FBI agents.
Oh, cool.
So she wasn't a criminal mastermind, but she wasn't this innocent old lady either. She was somewhere in between. And I think you have to go back and realize that these guys, most of these guys had been were murderers. And they knew that if they got caught and put on trial, back then the death penalty was pretty automatic for murder. And so they had nothing to lose. They were not gonna be taken alive if they could help it. So the majority of them, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie, obviously, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd, were all killed in action, and all of them had been killers, and they were not going back to jail, and they were not going to face the electric chair.
Interesting. Well, these FBI agents says, did the FBI start recruiting a different type of person? I've saw one thing where it looked like that they at least tried to select some ex-policemen, some guys that were real street savvy compared to those early accounts that they had.
They did, particularly after the fiasco at Little Bohemia. They brought in some guys who had been either Texas Rangers or cops in Oklahoma or Texas, who were good with guns. And they weren't intellectuals. They were not, law school trained or accountants. But their forte was shooting, and so they brought some of these guys in. And in fact, it was one of them, a guy named Charles Winstead, who was the man who shot John Dillinger in Chicago outside the Biograph Theater, and a couple other ones. Doc White, he was an ex Texas Ranger. If you're familiar, if you saw the movie, the Osage murders in
Oklahoma,
Killers of the Flower Moon, the Martin Scorsese movie. One of the lead FBI guy in that movie was a guy named Tom White, who was an ex-Texas Ranger. He's played by actor Jesse Plemons in the movie. His younger brother was Doc White, and Doc White was in on some of the later gunfights, including the one that in which Mama Barker died. So yes, so they brought in some of those guys, and they certainly helped in the final stages of the capture and killing of the most vicious of the criminals.
Interesting. They must have flown them around the country whenever they thought they were getting some of the bad guys surrounded or pinned down. They must have flown these special guys in, like bring in the SWAT team or the HHR, I think they call it now. But
yeah. But that's another thing. They back then there were bulletproof vests, which the agents sometimes wore, but as often or not, they decided, they were too bulky. Yeah. And so they wouldn't even wear them into action. And at least a couple of the guys who were killed, probably would have survived if they'd had their bulletproof vests on, but they just didn't use them. Now the criminals used them when they could. Yeah. And John Dillinger was saved once by when a Chicago cop shot him, not an East Chicago, Indiana cop during a bank robbery. Shot Dillinger at point blank range, but it bounced off his bulletproof vest. And so Dillinger lived another several months until he was gunned down without a bulletproof vest outside the movie theater in Chicago.
Yeah, I don't usually wear your bulletproof vest out on a date, I guess.
Yeah.
I never did. I remember when we first got them, and everybody got them. They were a pain. They were hot in the summer. They were bulky. They were hot, and these were a lot lighter and smaller than those ones back in the 30s. But
yes,
a lot of guys didn't wear them for a long time. Once you start wearing them, you'd go into work at night. One night I remember going in and I forgot it at home. I usually would carry it in because it was real hot. I'd carry it in, then put it on just before I went out. And I just felt naked all night long. It was real feeling of comfort with that bulletproof vest.
Yeah. And of course it didn't protect your face. So,
no, but you had a chance at least.
At least you had a chance, yeah.
Yeah, unless you're facing one of those BARs in that 30-06 round with just with military ammo, with the full jacketed ammo, would just cut right through like a knife through butter, man. It would not help at all.
Yep. Anyway, so that was Ma Barker, and she I think Shelley Winters played her.
I think you're right. There's iconic image of her battling it out with agents.
Yeah. So it's there's a kernel of truth in that movie in which she did go down firing a machine gun. Now, she didn't. None of the FBI agents were killed or were even hit in that final battle in Florida. Anyway, so that's her.
So your book, you deal a lot with the FBI agents. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the FBI agents that were especially tasked to go after these Midwest bank robbers? Because they were bad. They were the baddest of the bad at that point in time.
Yeah, I think over time, even the young lawyers and accountants got better at what they did. Yeah. They after a while, they sort of got the raids down. They got a protocol. They knew how to do it. And I think what they learned over time was that the only way you were going to get these guys was to outnumber them greatly. I mean, they had 20 law enforcement, FBI and police surrounding the Biograph Theater that Dillinger was killed in. There were at least 6 or 7 guys who gunned down Pretty Boy Floyd in a field in Ohio. Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed by a whole posse. So what they realized is that in a 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 battle, they were going to have the short end of the stick versus the criminals who were just better shots and more experienced and ruthless.
Yeah, right.
Sometimes the FBI guys would hold their fire in one case because one of the gun malls, Babyface Nelson's wife, was in the way, so they didn't shoot. And the criminals, they would not. They had no such inhibitions. They were. I should mention that a lot of the book talks about the so-called gun malls, and some of them were pretty interesting. Not just Bonnie Parker, but Dillinger's girls and Babyface Nelson's wife and Pretty Boy Floyd's girls. And some of them were prostitutes. Some of them were just looking for a good time, kind of a joyride kind of thing. Remember, this was the Depression, and it was a pretty bleak time. Some of these women, they might be a waitress in a little soup kitchen or diner, and they didn't make any money. And so this guy would come along and he'd flash his jewels and he'd flash his wad of money. And they said, hey, that sounds like a pretty good gig. Just, and they would basically scout ahead. They would rent the apartments that were the hideouts. They would cook the meals, and none of them ended up killed. I don't believe, other than Bonnie Parker, and she was more than just a sidekick. She was actually, she actually shot at people. So I talk about that in the book. It's kind of a debate through history. Did Bonnie Parker actually ever shoot at a law enforcement agent? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
At least on a couple of.
On that killing the two state troopers that were on motorcycles on, I believe it's Dove Road down, just outside of Dallas, north of Fort Worth. I believe they had a witness that saw her walk up to one of those troopers that was down and fire a gun into him. Is that true?
Yeah, that's sort of a disputed story. But what's not disputed, at least from the FBI's files and from one of the cops who was kidnapped and taken across state lines and finally let out, is that she did pull a gun a couple times on law enforcement agents. And interesting, Bonnie and Clyde were not. They were not nearly the big time bank robbers that these other guys were. They were, they knocked over gas stations and little grocery stores, for $25 or $40. But they attained a level of fame and infamy. A lot of it due to those photos that were found. They found some film in one of the places that they had vacated. And of course, they published those throughout the country in the newspapers. That was the famous one with Bonnie smoking a cigar. And
guns.
And holding guns against each other. Now, there was an interesting story that Bonnie, when they let go one of their hostages, a cop, he said, the newsmen are going to want to interview. What should I tell them? And, she could have said, tell him I didn't kill that guy back there. Tell him I didn't pull a gun. No, what she said, tell him I don't smoke cigars. She was outraged by that because it was just a playful. She didn't actually smoke. She did smoke cigarettes, but she didn't. She just posed with a cigar, and she was, enraged that she was viewed as a cigar smoker.
Our egos, our fragile egos.
Yes.
Yeah, they were kind of the John Gotti's of the bank robbers. They got all the publicity. The rest of the guys didn't get much. And Dillinger was not averse to publicity. If you remember those pictures he posed for there at the jail, at Crown Point Jail, with the lady sheriff there and everything, he was not opposed to little publicity.
Oh yeah, he had his arm around the prosecutor and vice versa, and he was joking with the reporters. And when Hoover saw that photograph, he went ballistic. He thought it was completely inappropriate that this prosecutor and local sheriff, were, chumming around with a killer like John Dillinger. Um, Interestingly, with Bonnie and Clyde and with John Dillinger originally, Hoover was not interested in getting involved in chasing those guys. He wanted to leave it to the locals. But what happened is Dillinger's fame, especially after he broke out of that jail allegedly with a wooden gun, and Bonnie and Clyde, after they had killed a number of law enforcement officers, they became so famous and infamous that Hoover decided, well, if his little agency, which was not that well known and kind of lightly regarded at the time, if they were going to be perceived as a top-notch criminal fighting unit, they had to get involved in going after John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah.
And the FBI was actually involved heavily in the search for Bonnie and Clyde. They were not there at the final ambush because the guy was off on some other case, and there's some suspicion that Hoover sent him on a wild goose chase so that he couldn't reap the glory of the ambush of Bonnie and Clyde, because he was having an affair with the wife of the district attorney in Louisiana, and that got back to Hoover, and Hoover thought, he was going to fire this guy, and so he didn't want him to get the glory of Bonnie and Clyde. So Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger, got all the publicity, even though the FBI was intimately involved in helping set up that ambush.
Interesting. There's a lot of little stories like that in this book, guys. I tell you what, you need to get this. Gangster Hunter, John Oller, right? Did I get that right? Oller?
Yes.
All right, John Oller, Gangster Hunter. John, I really appreciate you coming on and telling us these stories and telling guys what's in this book. And I've been looking through it. It's great. We'll use some of those pictures. And you guys, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see some of the pictures. They're interesting pictures that he's got in this book. It's almost worth it just for some of the photos and see like that baby machine gun. I'd never heard of that or seen that before. So and these are pictures that you got from relatives of the FBI agents, so they've never really seen the light of day before, correct?
Correct.
John, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I really appreciate you writing this book. It's going to be a real addition to anybody's true crime library, and certainly to mine. That's one advantage of doing this podcast is you can see the books in the background, and that's just a tenth of what I got, and I give a bunch of them away every once in a while to a friend of mine. So I get a lot of books doing this, and they're great books, and this is a particularly good one. John, you got any last words of wisdom for us?
No, I think I hope that some of these guys finally get their due in recognition. They're not going to become household names, but I think they're deserving of being remembered by history for really being, brave for doing this stuff when they were not really trained or qualified to do it.
Yeah, really.
But they did it. But they did the job nonetheless.
Yeah.
And they got their men. In the end, they got their men.
When one last story by me, I used to work with the FBI a lot when I was in intelligence. They'd always send their guys, their intelligence, their mafia investigators over to work with us to get a feel for the city and what was going on and, who was who and where things were. So we'd always take them down to Union Station and show them the bullet holes in the wall and say, this is where the first FBI agent got killed. So remember that.
That's true. And that's a big episode in my book too. I know you've covered it in another episode of your podcast, but there's a historical debate, which I don't think is much of a debate anymore, as to whether who were the criminals at Union Station in Kansas City and it's positive that Vern Miller, was one of them.
Yeah.
There's some question over who the others were, but I think it's pretty clear that Babyface Nelson, not Baby, Pretty Boy
Boy
Floyd
Floyd. Yeah.
was there, and his sidekick Adam Ricchetti.
Yeah. And I
There's
think
strong,
maybe they convicted Anna Brichetti on pretty slim evidence, but you know,
yeah,
they wanted heads after that
yes,
Union Station massacre. Somebody wanted a head. Somebody had to pay. And
yeah. I don't think Ricchetti he was not guilty of the crime that he was convicted of and executed for. I do believe he was there.
yeah,
Whether he fired any shots or whether he was just as a lookout or getaway car driver, or some people say he was too drunk to take
drunk, it
part.
wasn't sober enough. Yeah,
But I think where Floyd was, Ricchetti was. Ricchetti was always at Floyd's side, and
yeah.
I can't believe Floyd would have gone there without Ricchetti.
No, and Richetti's fingerprints were on a beer bottle at Floyd, the
Yes,
house Floyd been staying in. So those little
yes,
clues, forensic clues like that, would lead me to
yes.
believe that's, as you said, that's exactly who.
And Ricchetti he had no alibi. They asked him afterwards, where did you go after that? He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember where he went or why. It was consciousness of guilt. Anyway.
All right.
Um,
Okay, John Oller, Gangster Hunters. Great book, John. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
okay, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, guys, I like to ride motorcycles, so don't forget, watch out for motorcycles when you're out there. And if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website. And if you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, go to Anthony Ruggiano's website or go and find his hotline number or find him down in Florida. And if you have a problem with gambling, that's that 1-800-BETS-OFF. So that's all the public service announcements I have. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check this book out, Gangster Hunters. And don't forget to give me a review if you think about it, if you're on Apple Podcasts. And I've got some stuff for sale. And we take donations on my website, Gangland Wire. And I've got a couple of movies out there. Brothers Against Brothers, Savella Sparrow War, and Gangland Wire on Amazon. You can rent them for $1.99, and tell your friends about us and keep coming back and listen every week because we get a lot of good stories on here. So thanks, guys. So thanks, guys. So thanks, guys. So thanks, guys. So thanks, guys.